90-year-old veteran pleads for struggling son. Judge Caprio's powerful response inspires millions. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Providence Municipal Court in Rhode Island, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The familiar sounds of a busy courthouse echoed through the hallways, the shuffling of papers, muffled conversations, and the occasional tap of heels on marble. But today would be different. Today, a story would unfold that would touch the hearts of millions around the world. Judge Frank Caprio sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's docket with his characteristic thoroughness. At 84 years old, he had seen countless cases, witnessed thousands of human stories unfold before his bench. His kind eyes, framed by wire-rimmed glasses, reflected decades of compassion and wisdom. The walls around him were adorned with photographs, family pictures, commendations from various organizations, and letters from people whose lives he had touched through his unique approach to justice. Frank had always believed that the law was not just about punishment, but about understanding the human condition. His Italian-American heritage had instilled in him values of family, respect, and compassion, values that he carried into his courtroom every single day. His reputation for combining legal expertise with genuine empathy had made him not just a respected judge, but a beloved figure in the community. As he prepared for the morning session, Frank noticed something different about today's schedule. Among the usual traffic violations and minor disputes was a case that caught his attention. The plaintiff was listed as Thomas McCarthy, age 90, appearing on behalf of his son, Michael McCarthy, age 52. The charge was a series of unpaid parking tickets that had accumulated over several months, totaling nearly $800, a significant amount for most families. Frank paused, his pen hovering over the paperwork. A 90-year-old man coming to court for his adult son. This was unusual. In his experience, when elderly parents appeared in court regarding their adult children, the stories were often heartbreaking. They spoke of addiction, mental health struggles, financial hardships, or sometimes just the simple inability to let go of their parental instincts, even when their children had reached middle age. The courtroom began to fill with its usual mourning crowd. Court officers took their positions, attorneys shuffled through their briefcases, and citizens waited nervously for their cases to be called. The atmosphere was tense, as it always was in any courtroom. People came here because they had problems that they couldn't solve on their own, problems that had escalated to the point where the law needed to intervene. But Frank's courtroom was different from most. Over the years, he had cultivated an environment where people felt heard, where their humanity was recognized even in the midst of legal proceedings. His warm smile and gentle demeanor had a way of putting even the most anxious individuals at ease. He understood that for many people, appearing in court was one of the most stressful experiences of their lives. As the morning progressed, Frank handled each case with his characteristic blend of legal precision and human compassion. A young mother who had been caught speeding on her way to the hospital to visit her sick child was given a warning and a gentle reminder about safety. An elderly man who had forgotten to feed his parking meter was advised about the city's new mobile payment system and sent on his way with a reduced fine. Each interaction was a small lesson in humanity, a reminder that behind every violation was a person with a story, with struggles, with circumstances that often extended far beyond the simple facts listed on a citation. Frank had built his entire judicial philosophy around this understanding, and it had made him not just an effective judge, but a healing presence in his community. As the clock approached 11:30 a.m., the court clerk called the next case. Thomas McCarthy, appearing for Michael McCarthy. Frank looked up from his papers, his attention fully focused as he watched the courtroom doors open. What he saw was a sight that immediately touched his heart. an elderly man, clearly in his 90s, made his way slowly down the aisle with the aid of a walking cane. His posture spoke of decades of hard work and responsibility, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his head held high with dignity. He was dressed in his best clothes, a well-worn but clean suit that had probably served him for many years, polished shoes that had seen better days but still gleamed with care, and a simple tie knotted with precision. But it was his eyes that captured Frank's attention. They were the eyes of a man who had seen much in his lifetime: joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat, love and loss. They were eyes that had witnessed nearly a century of American history, that had seen the country change in ways that younger generations could barely imagine. And in those eyes, Frank could see a deep well of love and concern, the unmistakable look of a father worried about his child. Thomas McCarthy moved carefully but purposefully toward the defendant's table, each step measured and deliberate. The courtroom fell into a respectful silence as people recognized that they were in the presence of someone from another generation, someone who had lived through experiences that most of them could only read about in history books. As Thomas took his place at the defendant's table, Frank felt a familiar stirring in his heart. This was why he had chosen to dedicate his life to the law, not for the power or prestige, but for moments like this, when human stories intersected with legal procedures, when compassion could work alongside justice to create something meaningful and healing. The case file before Frank told a simple story in legal terms. Michael McCarthy, age 52, had accumulated 780 $60 in unpaid parking tickets over a 6-month period. The violations had occurred in various locations around Providence, mostly in commercial areas during business hours. On the surface, it seemed straightforward. A man who had ignored his parking tickets and now faced the consequences. But Frank knew that the legal facts rarely told the complete human story. Why had a 90-year-old father come to court instead of his 52-year-old son? What circumstances had led to this situation? What was the real story behind these accumulated violations? As Thomas settled into his chair, adjusting his cane and smoothing his jacket, Frank prepared himself for what he sensed would be a significant moment. He had learned over the years to trust his instincts about people and situations, and something about this elderly man's presence in his courtroom told him that this was going to be more than just another parking ticket case. The court clerk read the charges aloud, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. As she finished, Frank looked directly at Thomas, his expression warm and encouraging. He could see the slight tremor in the old man's hands, the way he gripped his cane a little tighter as he prepared to speak. This was clearly difficult for him, but he was here because he felt he had no other choice. Frank leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but clear as he prepared to begin what would become one of the most powerful and moving exchanges of his long career. Judge Caprio's voice carried across the courtroom with the warmth that had become his signature over decades on the bench. "Mr. McCarthy," he began, his tone immediately setting a tone of respect and compassion. "I see you're here today, representing your son, Michael. Before we discuss the parking violations, I'd like to understand why you've come instead of him." Thomas McCarthy straightened in his chair, his weathered hands gripping his cane as he prepared to share a story that had been weighing on his heart for months. The courtroom was unusually quiet, as if everyone present sensed that they were about to witness something profound. "Your Honor," Thomas began, his voice carrying the slight tremor of age but maintaining a strength born from decades of conviction. "I'm here because my boy, my son Michael, he's been going through some real tough times lately. He's not a bad person, Judge. He's never been in trouble with the law before, never caused anyone any harm. But life, well, life has been hitting him pretty hard." Frank nodded, encouragingly, his expression inviting Thomas to continue. In the gallery behind them, people leaned forward slightly, drawn into this unexpected human drama unfolding in what had started as a routine morning of traffic court. Thomas took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts and his courage. "You see, Judge, Michael lost his job about 8 months ago. He worked for 23 years at the same manufacturing plant, was a supervisor, well respected by everyone. But the company moved operations overseas, and just like that, hundreds of good people were out of work. Michael was one of them." The old man paused, his eyes reflecting the pain of watching his adult child struggle. "At 52 years old, Judge, finding work isn't what it used to be. Michael's been trying, Lord knows he's been trying. He goes to interviews, fills out applications, even took some computer classes at the community center to try to keep up with all the new technology. But companies, they want younger people, people who will work for less money." Frank listened intently, his own heart beginning to feel the weight of this family's struggle. He'd seen countless cases over the years where economic hardship had led to legal troubles, but there was something particularly poignant about hearing it from the perspective of an elderly father watching his middle-aged son struggle to find his footing. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. "These parking tickets, Your Honor, they happened because Michael was spending every day downtown, going from business to business trying to find work. Sometimes he'd park at a meter and go into 5 or 6 different places, talking to managers, leaving his resume, doing whatever he could to find a job. Sometimes he'd lose track of time, or sometimes he just didn't have the quarters for the meter." The judge's expression softened further as he began to understand the full scope of the situation. These weren't the parking violations of someone who was careless or disrespectful of the law. They were the inevitable result of a desperate man trying to provide for his family. "Michael's got 2 teenagers at home," Thomas went on, his voice beginning to crack slightly with emotion. "His daughter is a junior in high school, an honor student, and wants to go to college. His son is 15, plays on the school baseball team. Michael's been killing himself trying to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. His wife, Sarah, picked up extra shifts at the diner where she works, but it's still not enough." Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. "I brought some papers with me, Judge, if you want to see them. Unemployment notices, job applications, rejection letters. Michael's got a whole box of them at home. He's applied for over 200 jobs in the past 8 months. Frank's heart was beginning to break as he listened to this story unfold. He had presided over thousands of cases, but there was something about the image of a 90-year-old man carrying documentation of his son's job search that struck him deeply. This was a father who had never stopped being a father, who would go to any length to help his child, regardless of that child's age. "Your Honor," Thomas continued, "I know Michael should be here himself. I know a grown man should handle his own problems. But he's ashamed, Judge. He's ashamed that at 52 years old, he can't provide for his family the way he always did. He's ashamed that these tickets piled up because he was so focused on finding work that he forgot about everything else. And he's ashamed that his 90-year-old father has to come to court to try to help him." The old man's voice broke slightly, and he paused to compose himself. In that moment of silence, the weight of the situation seemed to settle over the entire courtroom. Here was a story that resonated with universal themes: the dignity of work, the struggle to provide for family, the pain of economic displacement, and above all, the unending nature of parental love. "I fought in Korea, Judge," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger again. "I came back from that war and worked 47 years for the same company, raised 3 children, bought a house, put money away for retirement. I thought I had done everything right, that my children would have better lives than I did. And they did for a while. But now," he gestured helplessly with his free hand, "now I watch my son, a good man who's worked hard his whole life, struggling to find a job that will pay him enough to support his family. I watch him come home every day more defeated than the day before. I watch him trying to hide his worry from his children, trying to pretend everything's going to be okay when he doesn't know how he's going to pay next month's rent. Frank found himself deeply moved by Thomas's honesty and pain. This was a man who had lived through the Great Depression, fought in a war, worked hard for nearly half a century, and was now watching his son face economic challenges that seemed to threaten everything the older generation had built. "The reason I'm here today, Your Honor," Thomas said, looking directly at Frank with eyes that held both determination and vulnerability, "is because I can't bear to watch my son carry this burden alone anymore. These parking tickets, they're just one more thing weighing him down. One more reminder of how everything seems to be falling apart for him right now." Thomas reached into another pocket and pulled out a small checkbook, the kind that elderly people often carried, with large print and worn edges from years of use. "I'm here to pay these tickets, Judge. I don't have a lot of money. I live on Social Security and a small pension, but I have enough to cover this. I can't give Michael a job. I can't make the companies call him back for interviews, but I can do this one small thing to help him." The emotion in the courtroom was palpable now. Court officers who had seen thousands of cases found themselves blinking back tears. Citizens waiting for their own cases to be called were completely absorbed in Thomas's story, seeing in it reflections of their own struggles or those of people they loved. "But more than that, Judge," Thomas continued, his voice now filled with a father's desperate hope, "I'm here to ask for your understanding. I'm not asking you to dismiss these tickets because I don't think Michael should be responsible for them. I know he parked illegally. I know there are consequences for that. But I'm asking you to see him as I see him, not as someone who willfully ignored the law, but as a good man who's been pushed to his limits by circumstances beyond his control." Thomas paused again, gathering his thoughts for what would be his final plea. "Michael doesn't know I'm here today, Judge. He'd be mortified if he knew his father was in court speaking on his behalf. But sometimes, when you're a parent, you do what you have to do, regardless of how old your children are. You never stop wanting to protect them, to help them, to make their burdens a little lighter if you can." The old man's voice took on a tone of quiet dignity as he concluded, "I'm 90 years old, Your Honor. I've lived through a lot, seen a lot of changes in this country. But one thing that's never changed is the love a parent has for their child. I may not be able to fight his battles for him, but I can stand beside him when he needs me most. That's why I'm here today." As Thomas finished speaking, the courtroom remained silent, everyone present absorbing the profound simplicity and power of what they had just heard. Judge Caprio sat quietly for a moment, his own emotions clearly stirred by this elderly father's heartfelt testimony. He had been moved by countless stories over the years, but this one touched something particularly deep in his heart. Perhaps because he too was a father, perhaps because he recognized in Thomas the kind of selfless love that transcended age and circumstance. Judge Frank Caprio sat in contemplative silence for several long moments, his eyes never leaving Thomas McCarthy's face. The courtroom remained hushed, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. A moment where law and humanity intersected in the most profound way possible. Frank's mind raced through decades of legal experience, countless precedents, and established procedures. But more than that, his heart grappled with the weight of the story he had just heard. This wasn't just about parking tickets anymore. This was about dignity, family, sacrifice, and the complex challenges facing working families in modern America. The judge's expression reflected the internal struggle between his legal obligations and his human compassion. He had always prided himself on finding ways to serve justice while honoring the humanity of those who appeared before him. But this case presented a particularly poignant challenge. How could he respond to such raw vulnerability and love in a way that honored both the law and the human spirit. Finally, Frank leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly as he gathered his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice carried a depth of emotion that resonated throughout the courtroom. "Mr. McCarthy," he began, his voice gentle but filled with unmistakable respect. "In 38 years on this bench, I have heard thousands of stories. I have seen people at their worst moments and their best moments. I have witnessed anger, defiance, regret, and redemption. But rarely, very rarely, have I been as moved as I am right now by what you've shared with this court." Thomas straightened slightly, his weathered hands gripping his cane as he prepared to hear the judge's response. Behind him, the gallery waited in absolute silence, everyone sensing that they were about to witness something that would stay with them long after they left the courthouse. "You spoke of shame," Frank continued, his voice growing stronger and more passionate. "You mentioned that your son Michael feels ashamed of his circumstances, ashamed that his father has come to court on his behalf. But let me tell you something, sir, and I want everyone in this courtroom to hear this clearly. There is absolutely nothing shameful about what your family is going through." The judge's voice began to carry the authority that had made him not just a respected jurist, but a moral voice in his community. Losing a job after 23 years of faithful service is not shameful. It's a tragedy that reflects larger economic forces beyond any individual's control. Looking for work day after day, facing rejection after rejection, and continuing to fight for your family's well-being is not shameful, it's heroic. Frank paused, allowing his words to settle over the courtroom. "And you, Mr. McCarthy, a 90-year-old veteran who fought for this country, who worked for 47 years, who raised a family and contributed to his community, coming here today to stand beside his son in his moment of need. That's not shameful. That's the most beautiful example of parental love I have ever witnessed in this courtroom." Thomas's eyes began to fill with tears, but they were no longer tears of worry and pain. They were tears of relief, of validation, of recognition. Here was someone in a position of authority who understood not just the legal facts of his case, but the human reality behind it. Judge Caprio continued, his voice now carrying the weight of decades of wisdom and experience. "You know, Mr. McCarthy, we live in a society that sometimes forgets the value of hard work, the dignity of honest labor, and the importance of family loyalty. We live in a time when economic forces can destroy decades of stability overnight, when good people can find themselves struggling through no fault of their own. But we also live in a society where fathers like you still exist. Fathers who never stop being fathers, who never abandon their children, regardless of age or circumstance." The judge leaned forward, his eyes locked on Thomas's face. "Your son Michael is not here today, but I want you to carry a message back to him from this court. Tell him that Judge Caprio said he has nothing to be ashamed of. Tell him that his efforts to find work, his dedication to his family, and his father's love for him are all things to be proud of, not ashamed of." Frank picked up the case file and reviewed it once more, his judicial mind working through the options available to him. But his decision had already been made not just through legal reasoning, but through the deeper wisdom that comes from understanding human nature and the complexities of life. "Now, regarding these parking violations," the judge said, his tone shifting slightly toward the practical while maintaining its warmth. "I understand that these tickets accumulated while Michael was downtown looking for work. I understand that they represent not carelessness or disrespect for the law, but the inevitable result of a desperate search for employment. And I understand that you, his father, are prepared to pay these fines out of your own limited resources." Thomas nodded, reaching again for his checkbook, but Frank held up a gentle hand to stop him. "Put that checkbook away, Mr. McCarthy," the judge said with a slight smile. This court is going to dismiss all of these parking violations, every single one of them." A gasp went up from the gallery, and Thomas's eyes widened in disbelief. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Your Honor, I don't understand. I came here prepared to pay. I have the money." Frank's smile grew warmer. "I know you do, sir. And the fact that you came here prepared to pay, despite your limited income, despite the fact that these weren't even your violations, tells me everything I need to know about your character and your love for your son. But this court recognizes that sometimes justice is better served through compassion than through strict adherence to penalties." The judge's voice took on a tone of explanation, as if he were teaching not just Thomas, but everyone present about the deeper principles that should guide the administration of justice. These violations occurred because a good man was desperately trying to find work to support his family. They represent not criminal intent, but economic desperation. And they have already served their purpose as a learning experience. Frank paused, considering his next words carefully. "But more than that, Mr. McCarthy, dismissing these tickets is this court's way of honoring what you represent. You are a veteran who served your country with honor. You are a father who worked hard for nearly 5 decades to provide for his family. You are a man who at 90 years old still puts his children's well-being before his own comfort. This community, this country, owes people like you a debt of gratitude, not additional financial hardship." Thomas began to weep openly now, overcome by the combination of relief, gratitude, and recognition. The weight that had been pressing on his shoulders for months began to lift, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. He stood up from his bench, something he rarely did during proceedings, and walked around to the front, closer to Thomas. The formality of the courtroom seemed to dissolve as the judge positioned himself not as a distant authority figure, but as one human being speaking directly to another. "Mr. McCarthy," Frank said, his voice now filled with the warmth of a father and grandfather speaking to a peer, "I want you to do something for me. I want you to go home to your son Michael, and I want you to tell him that his story, a family's story, is going to be shared with people all across this country, not because it's unusual, but because it's all too common. There are thousands of families facing exactly what yours is facing right now." The judge's voice grew more passionate as he continued. "I want you to tell him that his struggle matters, that his perseverance matters, that his love for his family matters. I want you to tell him that there are people in this world who understand what he's going through, who recognize his worth not by his current employment status, but by his character and his dedication to his family." Frank paused, gathering his thoughts for what he knew would be the most important part of his response. "And I want you to tell him something else. I want you to tell him that he has the most precious gift any man could ever ask for. A father who loves him unconditionally, who supports him without judgment, and who would walk into a courtroom at 90 years old to stand beside him in his darkest hour. That kind of love, Mr. McCarthy, is rarer and more valuable than any job, any amount of money, or any material success." The judge's voice broke slightly as he continued, his own emotions now clearly visible. "You see, I'm a father too, and a grandfather, and if I could hope for anything for my children and grandchildren, it would be that they would have even a fraction of the love and support that you've shown your son today. What you've done here isn't just about parking tickets. It's about the very best of what it means to be a parent, what it means to be a family, what it means to be human." As Frank spoke these words, something remarkable began to happen in the courtroom. People in the gallery were openly weeping, moved not just by Thomas's story, but by the judge's response to it. Court officers, attorneys, and citizens waiting for their own cases to be called found themselves part of something larger than a legal proceeding. They were witnessing a moment of pure human connection, a demonstration of compassion that transcended the usual boundaries of a courtroom. The impact of Judge Caprio's words rippled through the courtroom like stones cast into still water. Thomas McCarthy sat in his chair, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't expected to feel when he walked into the courthouse that morning. What had begun as a simple mission to pay his son's parking tickets had transformed into something far more profound. A moment of recognition, validation, and hope that would resonate far beyond the walls of this Rhode Island courtroom. Judge Caprio returned to his bench, but the formal atmosphere of the court had been forever changed. Everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the dismissal of parking tickets, but a powerful demonstration of how justice could be administered with both wisdom and compassion. "Mr. McCarthy," the judge continued, his voice now carrying the weight of someone delivering a message that extended far beyond the individual case before him. "I want you to understand something important. What happened here today isn't just about my decision to dismiss these violations. It's about recognizing a truth that our society sometimes forgets. That the measure of a man isn't found in his current circumstances, but in his character, his dedication to family, and his willingness to persevere in the face of adversity." Thomas nodded, still struggling to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had come to court prepared to pay a debt, to handle a problem quietly, and return home, hoping his son would never know of his intervention. Instead, he found himself at the center of a moment that seemed to capture something essential about human dignity and the power of compassion. The judge continued, his words now directed not just at Thomas, but at everyone in the courtroom, and by extension, to the millions of people who would eventually hear this story. "Your son, Michael, is not alone in his struggle. Across this country, there are countless good, hard-working people who have found themselves displaced by economic forces beyond their control. There are thousands of parents watching their adult children struggle, feeling helpless to provide the kind of assistance they once could." Frank paused, his expression reflecting the deep understanding that came from decades of witnessing human struggles from his unique vantage point on the bench. "But what your family represents, Mr. McCarthy, is something that gives me hope for our society. It represents the enduring power of family love, the strength that comes from standing together in difficult times, and the dignity that persists even when external circumstances are challenging." The judge's voice grew stronger as he developed his theme. "Too often, we hear stories about families falling apart under pressure, about generations growing distant from each other, about people losing their sense of community and mutual support. But here you are, a 90-year-old father, demonstrating that love doesn't diminish with age, that the bonds between parent and child can actually grow stronger when tested by adversity." Thomas found his voice speaking softly but clearly. "Your Honor, Michael is a good man. He doesn't deserve what's happening to him." "You're absolutely right," Frank responded immediately. "He doesn't deserve it. But life isn't always about what we deserve, is it? Sometimes we face challenges that seem unfair, circumstances that test our resolve and our faith. The question isn't whether we deserve what happens to us. The question is how we respond to it, how we support each other through it, and how we maintain our dignity and our values even when times are hard." The judge leaned forward, his eyes intense with conviction. "And based on what I've seen here today, your family is responding to this challenge exactly as it should be. Michael continues to look for work and continues to fight for his family's future. You continue to support him with unconditional love and practical assistance. Together, you're demonstrating that even in the darkest times, families can be sources of strength and hope for each other." Frank stood again, moving to the window that looked out over Providence, the city he had served for so many years. "You know, Mr. McCarthy, this courthouse sees a lot of sad stories. We see families torn apart by addiction, by violence, by selfishness, by all the ways that people can fail each other. But today, we saw something different. Today, we saw what families are supposed to look like. Imperfect, struggling, but united by love and commitment." The judge turned back to Thomas, his expression now radiating warmth and respect. "I want you to know that your story is going to be shared with people all over the world. Not because it's unique. As I said, there are thousands of families facing similar challenges, but because it reminds us of values that sometimes get forgotten in our busy, complicated lives." Thomas shook his head slightly, still overwhelmed. "I just did what any father would do, Judge." "But that's exactly the point," Frank replied with a gentle smile. "You did what every father should do, but not every father does. You put your child's needs before your own comfort. You swallowed your pride and came to a place that probably felt intimidating to ask for help on behalf of someone you love. You were prepared to sacrifice your own limited resources to ease your son's burden. These are the actions of a true father, a true man of character." The judge's voice took on a tone of teaching, as if he were addressing not just Thomas, but everyone who would eventually hear this story. "In our society, we often celebrate the wrong things. We celebrate wealth without asking how it was earned. We celebrate success without asking what sacrifices were made to achieve it. But what you've shown us today, Mr. McCarthy, is something far more valuable than material success. You've shown us what authentic love looks like in action." Frank paused, gathering his thoughts for what he knew would be his concluding message. "When people hear this story, and they will hear it, I hope they remember several important things. First, that economic hardship can affect anyone, regardless of their work ethic or character. Your son Michael's situation could happen to any of us, and when it does, we shouldn't judge or blame. We should extend compassion and support." The judge's voice grew more passionate as he continued. "Second, I hope people remember that family love doesn't have expiration dates. You don't stop being a parent when your children reach adulthood. You don't stop caring about their well-being. Stop wanting to help them. Stop worrying about their struggles. What you've demonstrated today is that true parental love is lifelong and unconditional." Thomas nodded, beginning to understand that his simple act of paternal love had become something larger, a symbol of values that resonated far beyond his individual situation. And finally, Frank concluded, his voice now carrying the full weight of his conviction, "I hope people remember that our legal system, at its best, should serve not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of justice. Sometimes that means recognizing that strict application of penalties would actually undermine the very values that laws are meant to protect. Values like family stability, human dignity, and community support." The judge returned to his seat, but his formal demeanor had been replaced by something warmer, more personal. "Mr. McCarthy, when you go home today, I want you to carry more than just the good news about these dismissed tickets. I want you to carry a message of hope, not just for your family, but for everyone who might hear your story and see in it a reflection of their own struggles and their own capacity for love." Thomas slowly rose from his chair, his movements careful but determined. As he prepared to leave, he turned back toward the judge, his voice filled with gratitude and emotion. "Your Honor, I don't have words to thank you properly. What you've done today, it's more than just about money or tickets. You've given my family something we haven't had in a long time: hope." Frank smiled, the kind of warm, grandfatherly smile that had made him beloved throughout his community. "Mr. McCarthy, you and your family already had everything you needed. You had each other, you had love, you had dignity, and you had perseverance. All I did today was recognize what was already there. as Thomas began his slow journey toward the courtroom doors. Supported by his cane but walking with renewed strength, the gallery began to spontaneously applaud. It started slowly, with just one person, then spread throughout the courtroom as everyone present felt compelled to honor not just Thomas's story, but the moment of pure humanity they had all witnessed. The applause followed Thomas as he made his way out of the courtroom, but its impact extended far beyond that moment. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of the 90-year-old veteran who pleaded for his struggling son would be shared millions of times across social media, discussed in families around dinner tables, and remembered by people facing their own challenges as a reminder of the power of love, compassion, and human dignity. Judge Frank Caprio returned to his docket, but he knew that this case had changed something in that courtroom, something in himself, and eventually something in the hearts of millions of people who would hear this story and be reminded of what truly matters in life. Not success or failure, not wealth or poverty, but the enduring power of family love and the capacity for compassion that exists within all of us when we choose to embrace it. The story of Thomas and Michael McCarthy would become more than just a viral video or a feel-good news story. It would become a testament to the values that sustain us through difficult times. A reminder that in our interconnected but often impersonal world, individual acts of love and compassion still have the power to touch millions of hearts and inspire us all to be better versions of ourselves. In the weeks that followed that transformative morning in Providence Municipal Court, the impact of Thomas McCarthy's appearance and Judge Caprio's compassionate response began to spread in ways that none of them could have anticipated. What had started as a simple legal proceeding had evolved into a powerful reminder of the values that bind families and communities together. The court's video recording of the hearing, initially shared on the courthouse's social media page as part of their regular documentation of proceedings, was picked up first by local Rhode Island news stations. Within hours, the story had spread to national networks, each one recognizing in this simple interaction something that resonated deeply with audiences across the country. Television anchors, many of them parents themselves, found their voices, breaking as they reported on the 90-year-old veteran's plea for his son. Radio talk show hosts, typically focused on political debates and current events, paused their regular programming to discuss what the story meant for American families facing economic uncertainty. Social media platforms became flooded with comments from people sharing their own stories of family support, economic struggle, and the power of unconditional parental love. But perhaps most significantly, the story reached the people who needed it most, families facing their own versions of the challenges that had brought Thomas to that courtroom. Across the country, unemployed workers watched the video and felt less alone in their struggles. Parents of adult children dealing with job loss, addiction, mental health issues, or other challenges saw in Thomas's example a reminder that their love and support mattered, regardless of their children's ages. Michael McCarthy, who had initially been mortified to learn of his father's court appearance, gradually came to understand the broader significance of what had occurred. The shame he had carried about his unemployment began to transform into something different. Not pride in his circumstances, but pride in having a father whose love was so strong, so unconditional, that it had moved a judge and inspired millions of strangers. The job interviews that had seemed so hopeless before suddenly took on new meaning. Employers who had seen the story began to look at middle-aged applicants with fresh eyes, recognizing in them not just workers seeking employment, but individuals supported by families who believed in them. Several companies in the Providence area, moved by the story, reached out directly to Michael, leading to interviews and eventually to a position that allowed him to support his family once again. Judge Frank Caprio, already beloved in his community, found his reputation extending. Far beyond Rhode Island, law schools began using the video as an example of how judicial discretion could be exercised with both legal wisdom and human compassion. Other judges, inspired by his example, began to look more closely at the human stories behind the cases that appeared before them. The ripple effects extended to policy discussions as well. Lawmakers began to examine how economic displacement affected working families, how unemployment systems could better support people in transition, and how communities could better assist families facing temporary hardships. The story became a catalyst for conversations about dignity, work, family, and the role of compassion in both legal and social systems. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt in countless individual moments when other elderly parents found the courage to support their struggling adult children, when judges chose compassion alongside justice, when employers looked beyond immediate circumstances to see the character of job applicants, and when communities rallied around families facing temporary hardships. The story of the 90-year-old veteran who pleaded for his struggling son became a permanent reminder that in a world often dominated by statistics, policies, and abstract discussions about economic forces, real change happens through individual acts of love, courage, and compassion. It demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful legal decisions are made not just with the head, but with the heart, and that the true measure of any society lies not in its wealth or power, but in how it treats its most vulnerable members and how it supports families in their darkest hours. Thomas McCarthy returned to his quiet life in Rhode Island, but his simple act of paternal love had created something lasting, a reminder that in an interconnected world, individual stories of courage, love, and compassion still have the power to touch millions of hearts and inspire positive change. In ways we can never fully predict or measure, his legacy would live on, not in grand monuments or formal recognitions, but in the hearts of everyone who heard his story and was moved to love a little more deeply, support a little more strongly, and believe a little more firmly in the enduring power of family and human dignity. Thanks for watching. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell us in the comments below if this story touched your heart. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next case. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of justice and compassion.